avui tindrem la gran sort de tenir 4 veus prominents palestines que ens parlaran de la situació sobre el terreny, sobre l'apartheid israelià, i també parlarem de què podem fer com a societat civil catalana per acabar amb aquest apartheid, perquè és imprescindible entendre que l'apartheid israelià només pot existir gràcies al suport de les institucions, de les empreses, de les universitats internacionals. I és el nostre deure, el mínim que podem fer és assegurar que no estem sent còmplices amb aquest apartheid.
Nosaltres, la comunitat palestina, cada any celebrem el Premi Esperança, un premi per reconèixer la solidaritat d'aquestes persones o d'una associació pel que està fent per Palestina. És també una mica perquè la gent sapigués que nosaltres, els palestins, ho tenim molt en compte de que la gent que no sigui palestina, gent catalana, estigui amb el poble palestí, perquè ens dona una mica d'esperança per continuar lluitant per la nostra llibertat.
Basically, Nakba is the name that was given to what happened in 1948, which was the official beginning of the colonization of Palestine, where Zionist troops, with the help of the British, took over about 78% of Palestine by force, going even beyond the UN partition plan, that included the ethnic cleansing of 85% of Palestinians, kicking them out of their villages, throwing them beyond the borders towards Lebanon, towards Syria, towards Jordan. It meant also that 85% of Palestinians became refugees, whether in refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza, but also internal refugees in 48, which is something that's not talked much about.
I think the Nakba is the event that determined our lives. It's not an event that happened in the past. It's an event that we carry with us every day. Also because the Nakba is ongoing. It's not an event that stopped. It is ongoing in terms of Israeli practices, what Israel practices on us, but it's also the fact that we lived a catastrophe in this magnitude where our entire families and entire communities were fragmented and displaced. So when we commemorate the Nakba every year on the 15th of May, we're actually not remembering a past event. It's actually living this event every day.
The Nakba is a daily occurrence, it's an ongoing occurrence, and I know it firsthand because my family and my community are actually threatened with displacement and expulsion from our neighborhood in Sheikh Jarrah and many neighborhoods as well. I could go on in talking about the Nakba, but the biggest evidence of the Nakba today is not only the ruins of the villages destroyed 7 decades ago, but the ruins of the homes destroyed just last week. And it's not only the 750,000 Palestinian refugees that were thrown out of their homes in 1948, but today the 6.5 million Palestinian refugees living in various refugee camps across the world. The Nakba is ongoing and it must end.
Looking at the state of Israel since its foundation, whether it's laws or policies or practices, they have been all molded and developed in order to benefit one people only, to give privilege to one people only, to eliminate the presence of another people, to oppress another people, also transfer and remove those people from their homes and from their lands.
Zionist leadership and European leadership were always presenting Israel as the Europe in the East, Europe against the East, Europe against the Orient, democracy and freedom against barbarism. But when you say, for example, it's the only democracy in the region, and we know it's not democracy. When you say, you could describe it like one of the descriptions, it's a villa in the jungle. Villa is Europe, and then jungle are the Arabs, you know, the barbaric people. That language also promotes violence against that region. I mean, you don't treat people in the jungle in a nice way. Jungle is associated with danger, wild animals. You need to tame them, you need to shoot them, you need to catch them. That's what Israel does. So it's easy for Israel to go after Lebanon and bomb the hell out of Lebanon, or Syria, or the West Bank, or Gaza, because these are like part of the jungle. These are like wild animals, dangerous animals. And they are not civil. They are not part of this kind of European, you know, civilized, you know, world.
It's a system that was, again, designed to allow one group of people to take over land, space, territory at the expense of another people. And this is why we see very discriminatory laws that come into place and legislations from the Israeli government and the Israeli parliament that limit Palestinians in where they can build, where they can buy land. The Israeli government and the Israeli state does not see anything wrong with that, because since its inception and even prior to its inception, it was founded on the basis and on the belief that the Jewish people have a right to this land, and it doesn't take into consideration indigenous Palestinian people.
We are all the people that the Israeli state wants to erase at some point. So it operates sometimes similarly and sometimes differently, but it's all for the same purpose, and it's basically eliminating the Palestinians and erasing the Palestinians.
A state that doesn't have equality between its citizens cannot be called democracy. So if I have a democracy only for Jews, this is an apartheid, because the Arabs are not included in that system.
It would take you not even a full day of living in any city in Palestine, and when I say Palestine, from the river to the sea, to realize that it's not a democratic state, not even for its own citizens that hold the Israeli citizenship. But a democratic state would not be, at the moment, attacking a crowd of people on a funeral just because it doesn't want a Palestinian flag in Jerusalem.
It's very sad that Shireen was killed. Killing her, I think, it's not a reckless issue. It's not by accident. I think it's a way to kind of crush the possibility of more journalists to come into where Israel intervenes.
Under international humanitarian law, which is applicable in the occupied Palestinian territory, under international criminal law, these are grave violations. Settlements, the forcible transfer, the transfer of Israeli civilians into occupied territory are not only grave violations, but also they make up war crimes and crimes against humanity. And these issues, they should be investigated, but between theory and practice and what the international community is willing to do in order to achieve justice and accountability for the Palestinian people, unfortunately, we have seen a huge gap. As a Palestinian trying to advocate before European politicians and policymakers, it's very, very, very frustrating, because you see how they can be very distant from the reality and from what's happening on the ground.
Some governments are like more sympathetic to Palestine than others, but they are locked into an international structure that is dominated by the US, and it's not going to change until that structure is taken apart.
Like in many other different places around the world where there is suppression and oppression, the private sector is very much and directly and indirectly involved in Israel's occupation, apartheid, colonialism, and ethnic cleansing in Palestine.
Everything that has to do with Israel is militarized. So also the economy is militarized. And when I say that, I mean that if you take, for example, the Israeli high-tech and cyber sector, for example, which NSO and Pegasus come from this sector. This is a highly militarized sector, meaning that who works at this sector and who establishes companies are veterans of elite units in the Israeli army. So basically, the high-tech sector is privatized military knowledge, is taking the knowledge of how to oppress people and then putting this knowledge into the private sector and then reaping profits from this entire process. Gaza, for example, is a major lab for Israeli weapon manufacturers, and Elbit Systems, for example, is a huge Israeli manufacturer of weaponry that is used against us. So it takes these weapons that kill Palestinians and circulates them worldwide. The fact that these are used on Palestinians and prove to be successful, and by successful meaning that they prove to kill and murder people, that gives companies a competitive edge in the world.
They're using Palestinians and Palestine as a lab, as a rat lab, where they can test and try the surveillance tools and services and then market them and sell them abroad in different countries. The international legal framework and mechanism is lacking of sufficient mechanisms and tools that would allow anybody anywhere in the world to try and hold businesses to account for their contribution and involvement in human rights violations, whether it's in a conflict-affected situation like Palestine or any other situation elsewhere. We need more mechanisms that would work globally, function globally, in order to ensure that corporations stop and are no longer acting with impunity in their activities anywhere around the world, but also including Palestine.
And I also want to send a message to journalists in particular. I'm not asking you as journalists to do me favors. I'm not asking you to be biased towards me. I'm asking you to do your job. Because when you look at an asymmetrical situation in which there's an internationally recognized occupation, where a nation with one of the world's most lethal armies, the Middle East's only nuclear country, is occupying and exiling and imprisoning and killing a population that is stateless, and you report on these things as clashes, or you report on them as equal sides, you are not being impartial or objective. You are in fact being the opposite. You are just a mouthpiece for Israeli state propaganda. So I'm not asking you to do any favors. I'm just asking you to do your job.
It makes a lot of difference to see active civil society, social movements, non-profit organizations or other groups, or even just individuals talking and speaking about Palestine and holding their governments and their institutions to account when it comes to their foreign policy, including when it comes to Palestine, because that's important.
La societat civil tenim un rol imprescindible en fer que les institucions prenguin aquestes decisions. Tots els drets no s'han aconseguit mai sols, no han set les institucions que han regalat els drets. No? Es tracta de que la societat civil pressionem. Per exemple, a nivell de la Unió Europea, ara mateix hi ha una campanya on s'han de recollir 1 milió de firmes, és una iniciativa ciutadana europea, i això obligarà a que el Parlament Europeu es parli sobre prohibir les relacions comercials amb assentaments a tot el món, incloent a territori ocupat palestí. També tenim campanyes a nivell comercial. Hi ha la coneguda marca d'esports Puma, que patrocina l'associació de futbol israeliana, que inclou equips d'assentaments israelians, que recordem que són un crim de guerra. Un altre exemple d'empresa cap a la que estem fent pressió és l'asseguradora AXA, molt coneguda per les seves assegurances mèdiques, que inverteix directament en bancs israelians, i sense aquests bancs israelians hem d'entendre que els assentaments israelians no serien possibles, ja que directament els financen.
But the thing that is very worrying and that is very dangerous is that even the space for civil society, whether in Europe or in the US or even, of course, in Palestine, even more starkly seen, that space is becoming smaller, and it's becoming even more difficult for an ordinary European citizen to talk about Palestine freely, because it has become very easy to say that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, or it is, supporting terrorism, or is biased, or.
I believe that there in Europe and all across the Western world, there's a crisis of free speech, particularly when it comes to Palestinian advocacy. There are many European countries issuing legislation, even in the United States as well, issuing legislation that would criminalize advocating for Palestinian rights. I can think about Germany, I can think about France. So what we require from Europeans, what we require from Westerners is a little bit more bravery.
I can't talk about Palestine without relating to what was happening in May last year, for example, because it changed things on the ground. So when I say May last year, I'm talking about what we now call the Unity Intifada. There was intensified practices of forced displacement happening in Jerusalem, specifically in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood that is constantly living under the threat of forced displacement. And then suddenly came this event where Palestinians everywhere took to the streets in a very defragmented and united way under the banner of Palestine. And for me, that is an achievement in of itself. Like regaining the feeling of hope after years of despair, that for me is an achievement. And I think today there is an entire generation that is gonna live this post-May 2021. In the events of May 2021, the presence of Palestinian women was immense. Palestinian women were those that were leading the protests and that were organizing the protests and were organizing these social solidarity structures. For many years, questions that were relating to violence against women were sidelined in the Palestinian politics, because there was this notion that we need to get rid of the colonizer and then we can deal with violence against women.
It seems that Palestinians, particularly Palestinian young, are relentless and undefeated, but it also seems that life is impossible in occupied Palestine. Resources are scarce and they're controlled by the occupation authorities. We have no freedom of movement. I think of the many Palestinian men now reaching their 7th and 8th decades who will see their grave before they even see the beach, right? The beach that's 30 minutes away from them. So life in Palestine is quite difficult. But what makes it bearable is the Palestinian spirit, which seems so undefeated. And that can only be accomplished when you believe in your own freedom and you believe in your own right to dignity, your own right to freedom, your right to freedom of movement, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a paradox. How can people be robbed of their rights and yet believe that one day they are going to be liberated?